What's up, everybody? Welcome in. Good evening, one and all, to our live stream event tonight. It's all about, as I say, dice and doctrine. And I'm here with my great friend Travis Shaw, and he's making a comeback to the
Yeah.
to the program. How are you doing, buddy?
Doing all right, man. Staying busy. Lots of great history going on. So we're bringing the history to the masses.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so happy to see you're well, and glad to see that all systems are go down there. And you're working hard as you always are, bringing history to the people in various ways. And we started chatting about this last year, I think, or 2 years ago. We started chatting about tabletop gaming, military miniatures, things like that. I saw you post all kinds of stuff like on your Facebook page and everything. And immediately I was like, I don't think I'd have the patience to paint all this stuff. But that got me interested in this kind of conversation because we all like to know where this kind of stuff starts. How do we get involved with thinking about these kind of miniatures and tabletop gaming? Travis, for you, where did that start?
Well, we've kind of talked about this in personal conversations, but I think it starts where a lot of people's interest in history starts. Going to historic sites, going to battlefields, and seeing those like old school dioramas with like thousands of little soldiers and all the terrain and everything. I remember just as a kid being totally enchanted by that. You just wanted to like open the case and play with them. Um, excuse me. And as a kid, I played with those little green plastic army men constantly. Like my mom probably still finds them out in the backyard when she mows the grass. That kind of tactile aspect of it really appealed to me.
Right.
And kind of alongside that came the interest in board gaming. As someone kind of interested in history, as a teenager, kind of coming into middle school, high school, finding it. Risk is kind of like the entry level game. It's got big maps, it's got little troops that you move over the map. You get to kind of pretend to be Napoleon. And Axis and Allies was a big one for me. Another kind of like gateway drug to this hobby. And from there it really took off. Kind of opened my eyes to this wider world of miniature gaming and board gaming, kind of wargaming in general. um, that is kind of offers infinite possibilities. You can find a game for just about any topic, any time period. So really went deep into board gaming. I've got shelves and shelves of games upstairs that you know I hardly ever play, but they're there, and just years of collecting. And then about 10 years ago, I had played miniature games before, but I finally started to like got enough confidence in myself that I can paint these things,
Mhm.
and I can game with them. So it helps
Nice.
that I have a lot of friends who do this hobby as well. There's obviously a lot of overlap in our historical community of people who are interested in, living history. People who are interested in like museum studies. People
Mhm.
who are into this kind of thing, kind of board gaming or tabletop gaming in general. There's a tremendous amount of overlap, and that's like the most important thing is having people to play with. I mean, it sounds kind of obvious and kind of stupid to say, but it makes all the difference in the world. So.
Yeah, I mean, I still go to a museum or a historic site, and I still get sidetracked by looking at the dioramas. And like we said offline, we just want to like try to figure out how to play with it, and we know we can't touch it. So in this
Uh,
way, you get to fulfill that dream, right?
yeah, I mean, I think another thing we mentioned was those old American Heritage Civil War books with like the bird's eye painting of the battlefield with like all the little figures running across it. And like I could really, as a kid, see imagine being in the middle of the battlefield. And so this was kind of an outlet for that.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
When did you have your first tabletop military gaming experience?
Oh God.
Remember?
I mean, I guess that depends on how we want to define this. But like I said, as
Okay,
a kid playing Risk,
sure.
playing Axis and Allies as a teenager really got me into it. And I remember going into game stores as a teenager at a time that kind of coincided with kind of a lull in this hobby, or kind of a downward, and we can talk about the history of the hobby in general.
Mhm.
But still seeing these games on the shelves, seeing copies of like Squad Leader on the shelf, things like that, and being like, oh my God, this looks so cool. I want to play this so bad. So I would like, scour flea markets and antique stores, used bookstores. They'd pop up.
Mhm.
Once eBay became a thing, that was a great way to acquire these games. I've gotten games as gifts from friends and things like that. Someone's grandpa would pass away, or their dad moved out and left this stuff behind. So I've been collecting for, I mean, well over 25 years now,
Mhm.
probably. And playing for, as I said, just as long. I want to give a shout out to actually my high school science teacher, Mr. Nickel. Um, although he was a science teacher, he was into this stuff, and one day he brought in a bunch of his miniatures to show me, and like blew my mind, and invited me to a convention up
Mhm.
just outside of Baltimore. And that was like my first experience at one of these. I mean, it was a smaller convention, like kind of a local rec hall, but there were dozens of games going on. I got to sit down and play a game, and that hooked me. So I've kind of been at it ever since.
As many people know, I helped to co-host an event last year at the Niagara Military Museum in Niagara Falls, Ontario, and we had something called Dice Days, and it was the first time I'd ever really been in that environment. I was basically the go-to for getting into the museum and getting the spot, and I was like, "This is
Yeah.
a great spot for like a gaming day," and then happened to run into some guys who run, a gaming society nearby, and it just worked out. And I was just really intrigued by the generations that I saw in there. There were three generations of people in there who were taking part in it. Of men, women, boys, girls, all this stuff, just hanging out and having a good time. And I think that really points to how this can become a mainstream thing for a lot of people in that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, kind of going back to the history of this hobby, I think, there was, particularly with board gaming, a golden age in the 70s.
Mm.
The commercial wargaming hobby, board gaming hobby, really took off in the 50s and 60s, and by the 70s, you've got, Avalon Hill, this massive company that's kind of the giant in the field, but you've got SPI, you've got all these other companies publishing just hundreds of games. And then it kind of crashes into the 80s and 90s. That kind of earlier generation kind of ages out, or they move on to
Mm.
different things. The rise of Dungeons and Dragons. Gary Gygax got his start working on wargaming rules. He had a set of medieval rules called chainmail, and then kind of translated that into what becomes Dungeons and Dragons. That takes a lot of people. This is pre-internet days. These are
Mhm.
small kind of niche hobbies, so people went to that. In the 90s, people start going to the Magic. Warhammer becomes the biggest tabletop game in the 80s and 90s, both in its fantasy version and its sci-fi version. So there's kind of like a bit of a downward spiral, and then in the late 90s, 2000s, it really rebounds. And like you said, it rebounds in a way that I think is more approachable and accessible to a lot of people. It's more appealing to a more diverse audience. Not every single game is, World War II, the Napoleonic Wars, or the Civil War. Now we've got games that represent conflicts from all different parts of the world, all different time periods, and games that I think really kind of blur the distinction of like what is a war game. Is a war
Mhm.
game have to represent actions on a battlefield, or kind of a strategic approach to a war, or can it be something modeling counterinsurgency? Can it be something modeling, one of the most popular war game in the world, if we want to call it that, is Twilight Struggle. It's about the Cold War. There's no like, or very little like direct conflict. It's more about ideological and political conflict,
Mhm.
economic conflict. So I think that has a lot to do with it. The board gaming world in general has exploded. Tabletop games really have taken off in a way that they haven't in decades.
Mhm.
You know, you can walk into like a Target and see a shelf full of kind of mainstream tabletop board games. And I think that's a good entry for people into this hobby. You know, COVID, oddly enough,
Yeah.
you know, like
Yeah.
it was hard to get face to face with people, but there's a lot of online options that we can go to for playing board games, you know, over the internet, and that kind of takes care of the problem of not having people to play with.
Mhm.
So we're kind of in a second golden age of gaming, I'd say, and like you said, it's interesting to see who's at these events. The biggest event of kind of this world, this weird subculture we're part of, is an event every summer called Historicon. It's held in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Um, it's like 4 days long. There's literally hundreds of games going on. I mean, it's a whole convention center, and every floor you go to, there's like games everywhere. It's wild. And one of the things that really struck me the first time I ever went was like I was expecting it to be only like old white dudes
Mhm.
because, you know, when I think about wargaming, I kind of think about that
Yeah.
like boomer generation that kind of grew up during that golden age. And what you see is a lot of young people.
Mhm.
You see a more diverse group of people than I would have expected to see. And I love that. I think it's, you know, I think like a lot of historical hobbies, there's hand wringing of like, oh, this generation's dying and like the hobby's dying and what's going to happen. No, it's not. It's just people are exploring it in their own way.
Mhm.
You know, there's so much out there. The internet has allowed these communities to come together and really find what interests them, and I think that that's awesome. Like I said, you can find a game on anything, and
Yeah.
that's cool. So,
Yeah, I sit down on YouTube and watch the guys from like Little Wars TV
mhm.
or Mark's Game Room or stuff like that, and they're at those events too. And it's just fun to watch them because one, I'm watching the gameplay, but two, being who I am and what I have done with digital stuff for years, I'm watching how they film it, and
Yeah.
it's just really neat to watch the storytelling aspect of tabletop gaming, not only in the game, but how people are also covering it is really cool to me because it's like you could really do an ESPN of tabletop gaming with this if you really wanted to nerd out and
Oh
do
man.
something different. But I think someone at that Lancaster event was live streaming it.
Yes.
Like
Yeah.
they had a camera above their table and we're live streaming it on Twitch, I
Yep.
think.
I was peeking in on that guy. Yeah,
Amazing.
glad you mentioned Twitch, YouTube, Discord, all of these
Mhm.
internet tools that we have at our command now, really allow us to showcase this stuff. I mean, when I get a new board game, the first thing I do is go on YouTube and search like how to play, and
Mhm.
there's videos of like, let's go into the rules, let's look at the components, let's you know, really kind of give you an introduction to this game, which is,
Right.
you know, I could have used that 20 years ago. But it's again helpful in getting new people into this hobby.
Mhm.
um yeah, I walked by that guy live streaming several times, and it was just so cool. And you know, you mentioned Little Wars TV. They've done a tremendous job of bringing this hobby to a much wider audience, a much younger audience,
Yeah.
and showing that like it's a cool hobby. It's fun. It's a way to explore history and, like you said, create narratives. You know, I think at the end of the day, all of these things, whether it's, you know, board games, whether it's miniatures, whether it's video games, we're kind of playing with those historical narratives. You know, you're given a set of historic parameters, historic limitations, and using that, kind of playing out those what ifs, which is,
Mm.
you know, as a historian, that's a tremendous amount of fun. So
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, you talked about how some games now are like counterinsurgency and stuff like that. I think far too often people who aren't in that realm, and myself included for the longest time, we think of tabletop game, military tabletop gaming, military miniatures as just being that generic World War II, American Civil War or War of
yeah.
1812, where I'm at, and we don't really think about how the doctrine idea has changed the gaming sphere. Do you want to talk about that a little bit about that, Travis?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the gaming that we have is a reflection of military experience, past military experience, and kind of what I mean by that is the birth of wargaming as we know it, modern wargaming, kind of comes about in the late 18th century in Prussia, and it comes about with military officers trying to train officers in how to conduct warfare. So they take the idea of kind of chess, like we're going to have pieces, we're going to have a grid, but we're going to take it one step further. This grid is going to represent forest or rivers. This piece is going to represent an infantry regiment or a cavalry battalion, whatever. And they're kind of playing out their battlefield experience from the 18th century, and that's going to go on through the 19th century. The Prussians are kind of infamous for this, the Kriegspiel, as they call it, and you kind of see it in almost a reflection of that in the commercial wargaming industry that pops up in the 1950s. This is the generation that's fought World War II. A lot of these guys either served themselves or their dads served. They have a direct connection to D-Day. They have a direct connection to the Battle of the Bulge. They're really kind of fascinated by this aspect of kind of playing with history. And so you're also getting into in the 1960s a Civil War centennial. So all of this stuff is very much at the forefront of people's minds. That's obviously going to change in the 70s. The Vietnam experience really, in many ways, and I don't want to get too deep in this, changes the way Americans interact with the military and understand the military,
Right.
and understand kind of the American presence in the world. And you start to see a shift, kind of a subtle shift in some of the games that appear, and then it really comes to the forefront in the post 9/11 world. Now we're fighting an entirely different kind of war, and so you see actually games about the war on terror. There's a really famous and, in my opinion, great game called Labyrinth, which is the war on terror, and it's subtitled 2001 to question mark.
Hmm.
And
Wow.
in that game, one player is playing kind of the United States, and the other player is playing kind of generalized like Islamist terrorists, which you can imagine was very controversial at the time. I mean, this game came out before bin Laden was killed. I mean, it was, and it's designed by a guy named Volko Runke, who is a CIA guy. I mean, he's been working at the agency for decades, and his area of expertise is kind of counterinsurgency. And how do you simulate that? It's not as simple as having two pieces on the battlefield, like, okay, this is the 20th Maine, this is the 15th Alabama, they're going to fight.
Right.
It's how do we approach ideas of like power projection? Is this military power? Is this soft power? What are the end goals here? If you were playing as the Islamist character in Labyrinth, or player in Labyrinth, you are going to be destabilizing regimes and trying to force your perspective on countries in the Middle East. How do we talk about terrorism? How do we talk about unsavory things? One of the biggest pitfalls, I think, of a lot of games, and this goes for both tabletop games and video games, it's like, do we talk about World War II without addressing the Holocaust? Because
Right.
it had an impact on the military strategy of Nazi Germany. Do we talk about the impact of slavery on the Confederate war effort? So sometimes we do dabble in these things, but it's definitely come to the forefront with a lot of these games. That same designer, Boko Runke, has kind of started a whole series of counterinsurgency games, coin games, that address these kind of conflicts. Starting with, I think the first one was in Peru, kind of the Tupac Amaru, the leftist
Oh yeah.
revolution there. But he's done one on the Vietnam War. He's done one on Afghanistan. He's did one working on one about the Chinese Civil War. So like addressing conflict not just as military units on the battlefield, but as kind of that idea of hearts and minds of,
Mhm.
how do we, um, military success, or wars, the success of a military force isn't just dependent on their battlefield performance, that
Right.
there are other things going on. One of the particular things I love about those games is they tend to be multiplayer and kind of multipolar. So, for instance,
Mhm.
the Vietnam game Fire in the Lake, you have one player who's playing the United States military, another player who's playing Arvin,
Mhm.
the South Vietnamese, and then you have a Viet Cong player and an NVA player.
Wow.
Only one player can win the game. And it kind of addresses that idea that you have two sides with two different factions per side that are working together, but their objectives aren't always the same.
Mhm.
Which I think really addresses the complexity, or at least how we look at the complexity of modern war, that it's not just, one side lining up and blasting away at the other side, that there's, you know, um, a lot going on behind the scenes. One of the games in that series that I particularly love because of my own personal interest is the American Revolution. We don't think of the American Revolution as a counterinsurgency, but it fits the
Mhm.
model of the game pretty well.
Mhm.
You have the Americans and the French on one side, you have the British and the Native Americans on the other, and just because the British and the Native Americans are fighting the Americans, the rebels, doesn't mean that their objectives are the same. And I love that about the games because it really it kind of addresses some of the complexities of the conflict, and kind of makes you think about you know it's not just a two-sided issue. Within these conflicts there's multiple different players all kind of grasping for their own, their own objectives.
Mhm.
So
That's really neat. And you know, I would say that probably the early part of the revolution can be really seen as a counterinsurgency in that way, like what we're going into this year with the 250th. Is to me is 1775 to me is counterinsurgency from the British standpoint. But that's debatable with people because some people believe one way and some people believe another, but we can't make generalizations, and those kind of games really allow us not to make the generalization apparently because everyone's got their own uh, goal in mind.
yeah, I mean, and it's kind of a cool system too, because you can apply it to non-military
Mhm.
perspectives. One of the games in the series actually revolves around Gandhi and the Indian independence movement. There's another one about kind of the pro-democracy movement in the Philippines in the 80s. These aren't kind of counterinsurgency wars the way we think. It's not Vietnam, it's not Cuba, it's not Afghanistan. But you do have these kind of multiple factions all vying for victory,
Mhm.
supremacy. You're vying to get their objective within the system. So it's kind of, I don't want to go too far, but it is one of the kind of the leading edge in terms of how do we simulate conflict. Not all conflict is military, and
Right.
kind of goes back to my point of like, how do we define a war game? Does a
Mhm.
war game have to be soldiers shooting at each other, or
Mhm.
can it be more than that?
Mhm.
So,
Well, speaking of which, I know you have a pile of stuff you want to showcase,
buddy, you have no idea.
and I want to give you plenty of time to show everyone what did you pull for tonight for this evening
Um, so
showcase.
I have way too much stuff. I mean, again, one of the joys of miniature wargaming is, again, like I have stuff from the Bronze Age up to the Cold War,
Mm,
and all different scales, all different sizes.
yeah.
Um, I do have a few things sitting here. The closest thing to me is actually the latest project I've worked on.
Okay.
So, um, when it comes to kind of tactical wargaming, I love kind of small scale, small unit, like a platoon on the table, because it kind of gives you that nitty gritty feel that like you're the lieutenant out there, you're leading your dudes across the battlefield. There's something kind of very personal and very satisfying about that, and me and my gaming group, we play a number of different games. One game that we've been particularly obsessed with lately is called Combat Patrol. It's initially designed for like World War II, small scale, like platoon on platoon action. Um, and I just painted up a whole mess of World War II Australians
Oh,
for the
wow.
Pacific Theater. So I'll just kind of hold some of them up
Yeah.
here. This is, an Australian
Oh,
officer. He's got his machete. He's got his Owen gun. He's ready to go in the bush and
that's cool.
fight the Japanese. I mean, I can't show you. There's like a box of like 30 of them right here. But one of the things I really, here's another guy right here. One of the things I really love about this hobby, and in particular miniature gaming, is like I didn't know anything about Australia and World War II before I started this project. I knew that they were in the Pacific. I knew that they, played a role in the war, but
Hmm.
I couldn't
That's
tell
cool.
you much more than that. And so
Right.
in the process of learning about this, you're painting this, you kind of start with the surface level stuff. Oh, like this is what their uniforms look like. This is the
Mhm.
kind of guns they carry and so forth. And then you kind of get into, well, what were they actually doing? What was the experience of an Australian soldier in New Guinea? What were they doing later on in the war? Towards the end of the war, invading Borneo and stuff like that. And so it gives you an excuse to really. Sorry, I'm looking for one particular guy because I like him. Oh, yeah, here he is. He's my sniper. He's like hidden in the bushes here. You can barely see him.
Oh my gosh, that's cool.
Yeah. And one of my friends, and Ian in
Oh yeah.
my gaming group, he painted up a bunch of Japanese guys. So like we're gonna get these guys on the table and we're gonna kind of play out a small level skirmish between these Australians and these Japanese.
Mm.
Now, right before I did these guys, I was working on Hittites and New Kingdom Egyptians. So like there's this wild disconnect there, but that's
Yeah.
the joy of the hobby is there's all kinds of ways to kind of approach it.
Hmm.
Some people, I like the rules. I like reading different rule sets and figuring out how they model things like command and control and initiative. Um, some people just like the miniatures and like painting them. I like painting them, but it's not my favorite part of the hobby. But
Hmm.
so
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm hoping to do more to take part in the games instead of having all this responsibility of painting all this
Mhm.
stuff. I just want to jump into different time periods without having all the things involved with painting and
Yeah.
storage and stuff like that. I'll gladly help set up a table if someone wants to do that, but it's like that's about it. I don't want to have to take this stuff to my home. My apartment won't like it.
Yeah. I've got a lot of space tied up in these guys, and I know a lot of my friends that I play with have multitudes more than I have, but it is a pretty cool hobby. You'll appreciate these. I brought these down just because of you. Um, this was a project I finished sometime last year. I did a big AEF project, so World War One
Oh, cool.
Americans, and I did them. So these are 15 millimeters, so much smaller than the guys I was showing off. But
Oh,
there's kind of
nice.
like AE officers or AEF
Yeah.
officers leading the guys through the wire. Um, we've got some, little 37 millimeter gun here, guys.
Oh, that's neat. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and because I'm a sucker for local history, I actually made them kind of in my mind at least to the 115th, so the Maryland National Guard, and I have them. The command is between Domvilliers and Constantvoy, so they're in the Meuse Argonne. Um,
Very
so
cool.
yeah,
Very cool. Yeah.
um, yeah.
Yep.
Like I
AEF
said,
for my guys.
any
So,
time period I will do.
yeah.
Even periods that I thought I would never be interested in. I have a whole mess of like Dark Age Irish, so like kind of like fall
Mm,
of Roman Britain Irish raiders.
wow.
Um, just looking at the pile here, I've got all my Romans, my Carthaginians, my Persians. I've got a huge box of English Civil War guys sitting here.
Mm,
It's cool. I've got my World War II Romanians. because
Oh, that's
I needed
cool.
something for the Eastern Front, and I didn't want to be boring. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. I totally get that. It's really neat how you can do these little niche things. It's niche to sometimes a Western audience. Eastern audience is going to be like, well, yeah, we know all about this and that, et cetera. Or someone who may study Eastern Europe knows about some of that stuff. But to the generic Western audience, that could be niche. And it's like, okay, we can discuss this now, and it piques that interest, right? Like you said, you want to learn more about the Australians and the Pacific because you painted them. Now you're going to want to learn more about the Romanians and what they're doing.
yeah, I mean, like I said, I kind of the group that I currently game the most with, and they're mostly guys that I met through reenacting. We started out doing kind of pike and shot era, so like 17th century,
Mm,
which was not a period I had any interest in walking into, and now I've got like huge number of English Civil War guys sitting here. I've got like Scottish Covenanters. We it really it's a gateway to learning more. I we have these great conversations in our group of like, oh, I found this cool rule set. I want to learn more. Play this period. Do you have any interest in this? And I'm like, yeah, okay, cool. Like, let me read up on it. Hit the Wikipedia article. Oh, okay, that looks cool. And then you do the deep dive on this is something I want to devote hours and hours of time to. So it's really been a fantastic hobby for learning more and like broadening my horizons. Like I said, I was working on these Bronze Age guys. I knew absolutely nothing.
mhm.
Beyond like, okay, the Hittites are like Turkey, the Egyptians are down here. Now I've, you know,
Now you know.
got a stack of books next to my bed right now about this stuff.
Yeah.
So it's a great way to learn and a great actually, we kind of talked about the educational use of gaming, and
Mhm.
is it educational? Is it something that belongs in the classroom? I'd say the biggest educational benefit of this is just opening those doors and piquing that interest in a period of history that you might not have any interest in. So,
Mhm. How does this play out, no pun intended, Travis, with when you're not reenacting in the field and now you get to kind of do like your own kind of deal on tabletop gaming where it's like, okay, I may not have an event for the next 6 months, 2 years, whatever, but I can do something tabletop and kind of get that kind of scratch that itch.
well, I mean, my favorite joke about this is like, as a Rev War guy, I can at least get 100 guys on the table that are all dressed the same and look right, uh, which is like
Right.
impossible at a reenactment.
Yeah.
It does have the benefit of being portable and being easy. I try to get together with this particular group like once a month.
Mhm.
We'll meet up. There's a great gaming shop here in Northern Virginia that we meet at. Um, there's another group of guys I play with who are mostly retirees that play maybe once a week, twice a week, and if I can get off on a weekday, I'll go play with them. So it's a lot easier to scratch that itch.
Mhm.
um, yeah. And as I said, board gaming too is a lot easier because there are digital tools that we can use now. There's a freeware kind of software program called Vassal, which is basically just a virtual version of the board game that you can play with. You can connect with someone online, you can chat with them while you're playing. You can press the little button, it'll roll the dice for you, it'll keep a log of everything that's going on. It won't play the game for you. It doesn't have the rules necessarily programmed in like the computer war game would,
Right.
but you can drag and drop the pieces around and you can play these games in real time, which is fantastic.
Mm.
I mean, during COVID, I was playing with dudes all the time, friends, all up and down the East Coast, because it was a way to socialize and it was a way to keep active and hang out with those friends, even if we couldn't be face to face.
Mhm.
So,
Mhm. Yeah, what right now is your favorite?
oh God, I was afraid you were
What's
gonna.
your go-to? If I stopped over to your house and I'm like, "All right, we're playing a few rounds tonight." What are you pulling out?
Miniatures or board games?
I gotta say board games first.
Board games. Okay, boy. Um, there's a lot of board games that I'm really in love with. One of my favorite games, series of games, is actually an older series, initially published by Avalon Hill in the 90s, called The Great Campaigns of the American Civil War.
Okay.
One of the things I love about board gaming is you can take the conflict on a much bigger scale. You don't have to be the lieutenant on the field with a platoon of guys or whatever. You
Right.
can be Grant or Lee. I brought one of them down. Um, Roads to Gettysburg is one of the original ones from the
Oh yeah.
90s, covers the Gettysburg campaign. And when I say campaign, it doesn't just focus on those 3 days in July. It focuses on the entire lead up and aftermath of the battle.
Hmm.
In fact, actually fighting the battles in this game is, I don't want to say an afterthought, but it's not the kind of the meat of the game. And you'll understand once I show you, because the meat of this game are the absolutely incredible maps. These are based on historic
Wow.
maps. One hex is about 1 mile. So if you have all the games in the series, you can basically do Petersburg up to Harrisburg. And you can see, you're maneuvering not
Hmm.
regiments or not, squads of guys or whatever. You're maneuvering corps and brigades.
Hmm.
And the thing I love about this is, when I think about the Civil War, when we study the Civil War, a big part of that is, you know, road networks. Why did the armies end up at Gettysburg?
Right.
How did they get to Gettysburg? One of the other games in the series, probably my favorite, it covers the Antietam campaign, and I love it because it's the same roads and towns and villages I grew up kind of hanging out in.
Hmm.
If we were to look at this map, I could probably find your old house on here. Um, I
Probably.
love having that kind of general's eye view of, okay, like the decision here, and every war game, no matter what scale it is, comes down to decisions. How do I get to that objective? What is the quickest way? What is the best way? Looking at the terrain, okay, like, here's some high ground here. I want to make sure the enemy doesn't occupy that. Here's a river crossing that I need to secure before the enemy does. Here's a rail line that I need to cut. Um, when I think about the Civil War, that's the kind of level that I get into, kind of that, like that Bruce Catton, Shelby Foote kind of like, and like I'm the general looking at a map on the table and like we need to, we're gonna try to keep Lee from marching on Baltimore. How do we do that?
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
um, absolutely love this series of games. Avalon Hill, the company that started this series back in the '90s, kind of the biggest board gaming company of this type, got bought by Hasbro in 1998 and kind of wiped out their wargaming business.
Wow.
And another publisher, thankfully, Multiman Publishing, has taken up this series and they've expanded it well beyond the Eastern Theater. They just came out just a few months ago with a game covering the Vicksburg campaign. They've
Hmm.
got the Atlanta campaign, Hood's Drive into Central Tennessee. All of these really cool, um, not cool, be like interesting
Yeah.
campaign studies. You can only refight the Battle of Gettysburg so many times, but with this
Right.
game, who knows? Maybe they'll catch up with each other in Carlisle. Maybe they'll fight on the Pipe Creek line.
Hmm.
All of those kind of what ifs, you get a chance of playing those out. So yeah, great campaigns of the Civil War. Love it. Absolutely love it. I have all of the original Avalon Hill games in the series.
Hmm.
Don't have any of the newer ones because unfortunately they're a little pricey, but I'll get there eventually. So that's my choice for board gaming.
Okay.
For miniature gaming, I'm gonna go a little more off the rails here. Hold on a sec.
Travis
Oh my
Shaw
god.
going off the rails? No.
Yeah, I know.
No.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
So, my good friend Mark, who I game with a lot, introduced me to a game called Triumph, which is very abstracted game that covers warfare from like the Bronze Age up to the medieval period. And you can like go online. There's over 600 army lists, so you can say like, all right, I want to do Carthaginians, and it'll tell you like how to construct your army. who they can fight against, and so
Hmm.
forth. And you have kind of these blocks of men that go around the battlefield, representing much larger formations. So I will pull out. Let's see. Ooh, some of my Persians. Here's my Achaemenid Persians.
Let me
So like
take.
this is my Persian general and his crew. Um,
Oh
and
yeah.
again, these are like 15 millimeter guys. So they're a little smaller than what you saw. Here's some. Let's see. Where are the Macedonians that they fight against? Here we go. Here's some Macedonians. So you have these like little blocks of dudes, and you might have, I don't know, a dozen of them, 15 of them or so. It depends on the army and how it's constructed.
Hmm.
And you play the battle out, and like it's very abstracted, very simple. It plays quick. I mean, a game of Triumph, half an hour maybe. Um, but it has like a weird kind of depth to it. Each different type of troop, there's like 25 different types of troops, has like their strengths and their weaknesses. You like want your pike going up against horse because like horses, can't deal with long pointy spears.
Right.
You want your archers shooting at knights, but like God, if the knights catch them, they're going to be destroyed. That kind of stuff. So there's enough, again, that idea of decision or choice. You only have a certain amount of command. You roll a die, and that's basically how many command decisions you can make that turn. So you have to prioritize who's going to go where, who's going to do what. You can't win everywhere on the battlefield at once, so you have to prioritize. Like, if I can hold here on the left long enough to crush them on the right, like, um, which I think, even though the game is very simple, I could teach you how to play it in 15 minutes. The results and kind of the process are there. And that's what I really love about this game. And like I said, you can play it quick. It's fun. The variety of dudes. I have my Persians in here. I've got, here's some, of course, Carthage. We have to have elephants if it's Carthage. So, I've got my Carthaginian elephants.
Oh yeah. That's cool.
Here's some of Hannibal's veterans. And then, of course, since we have Carthage, we've got to have Romans. So, here's some early, like, plebeian Romans. And, like, again, I knew
Nice.
next to nothing about that period of Rome. We're kind of used to the imperial Rome. So,
Right.
that was a learning experience. All of these projects allow me to take a deep dive on like some really obscure topics and have a lot of fun with it. So,
I
um,
I saw a video online. I think it was Little Wars. They did. Oh, it was a Pacific Theater game. I can't remember the name of it, but anyway, they did the Fog of War in it, and they had their predetermined position for one side. The Japanese had their
mhm.
positions, and then they were bringing the Marines on the beaches, and they had to decide what beach we're going to take, and are we going to split our force? We're going to do this, not knowing where the Japanese positions were because of the fog of war. And I thought that was a really awesome way to do it because that's realistic to like, hey, we don't know where the bunkers are. We don't
Yeah.
know where the machine gun nests are until we get in there.
I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because obviously no game is a perfect simulation of history. There's just too many variables. There's infinite number of variables. Um, every game designer has to pick and choose, what do you abstract, what do you leave out, what do you bring to the forward, what is the crux of this game, what are we going to give the player to work with. And one of the biggest limitations of a lot of games is, of course, fog of war. If we're playing on the same board, you can see everything that's there. And a lot of games have come up with very very clever ways of addressing that. And I
Mm.
know the game you're talking about on Little Wars, there's it really helps a lot of the best games I've ever played. There's been kind of an umpire or like a non-player who's kind of guiding the game
Uh-huh.
and making those kinds of calls, like, okay, like, you've spotted this guy, you can see him now, like, put him on the board. Or like if there's an ambush, you have to like write down where that ambush is going to take place, and if the enemy stumbles into it, then they like get attacked.
Mhm.
It's one of the most difficult ways or issues to address. And again, it all has to do. A lot of it has to do with the scale of the game. That series, Great Campaigns of the Civil War. You know, if you're the Union leader, you can see where the Confederates are headed. One of the ways they address that is movement is random. So Jackson's corps starts off that morning, they might only march 5 miles, or they might march, 10 miles. We don't know.
Mhm.
Kind of randomizes that. I also know people that play that series with a third party umpire that kind of keeps track of where both armies are, but neither army knows where the opponent is unless they send cavalry out, unless they kind of bump into them.
Mhm.
Another one of my favorite board gaming series is a series by Avalanche Press, Great War at Sea and the Second World War at Sea. Again, you're kind of commanding fleets, and those fleets, in order to actually come into contact and fight each other, you have to spot them. In World War II,
Mhm.
that means sending out a lot of planes and trying to find where the enemy is, what they're up to. It really, and you have to pre-plot your movement, so you aren't able to react immediately to what the enemy is doing, because you you know you don't know where they are when you write that order down. So
Right. I love
yeah.
that. I love the fog of war,
um,
and I think it really helps people to understand that, obviously, uh, a layman is going to understand tactics and stuff when they can see everything of the other side. You can see where they are, you see where they're going, and it's kind of easier to check a move or do whatever in that way. But if you have no idea what pass in the mountain they're coming through, if they're coming through, and all,
right.
it really adds to that. It takes away from that idea of, oh, hindsight is 2020 kind of thing. Where you have
Yeah, I mean,
no
a lot
idea
of
where they are
games.
at.
Yeah, especially board games, you'll have like decoy pieces. So you might see three different armies out there, but then you get close and you realize only one of them is the true
Mm,
enemy force. It's again, one of the biggest, and honestly, in my opinion, one of the few advantages of computer war games. And a lot of the early, especially computer war games, were just kind of translations of these board games, is that you have that fog of war built in. You have a computer that's controlling what's going on. um, it's much more difficult on the tabletop to do that,
mhm,
but there are ways of doing that. A lot of games, miniature games, have like spotting rules where, like, if they're beyond a certain distance, or if the weather's bad, or if there's woods or hills in the way, you can't see the enemy, you can't spot them.
mhm.
um, we play a Cold War game, really great rule set called 7 Days the River Rhine. Kind of the conceit is that the Soviets had made their push, across the border. They're heading to the Rhine, and there's kind of cool defensive rules where you put a bunch of counters out on the battlefield that are potential units, and you don't know until you get within spotting range, especially with a recon unit, if it's an actual enemy unit or not. So, like, when you're rolling through some town in West Germany, you've got to be careful because that there's enemy contacts out there. Is it a false contact, or is it Carl Gustav team ready to launch an anti-tank missile into your tank?
Right.
So that's one of the things I think about wargaming that's really changed in kind of this second golden age, or the modern age of gaming, is more thought has been put into that, into issues like fog of war, into issues of, and I know he's not your guy, but what Clausewitz would call friction, kind of the
Sure.
breakdown in command that happens once combat begins,
Right.
whether that's on a small level with my little Australians, a weapon jams,
Mhm.
whether that's like someone's morale breaks and they retreat or they rout, whether it's an issue of mistaken orders. A lot of these miniature games have random events that can come up. You roll snake eyes. Oh crap, something bad happened. Um,
Yeah.
I was playing a game the other day and this happened where, I was just about to achieve one of my objectives and I got a negative random event and my unit got mistaken orders and actually fell back. And I'm just, but
Oh,
that's, I'm
yeah.
sure a feeling that commanders have felt since the dawn of time.
Hmm.
So I feel like that's an innovation, maybe not an innovation, but something that a lot of modern game sets and game rules really stress. I mean, the great grandpappy of all that is Squad Leader, Advanced Squad Leader, this World War II board gaming set that really set the standard for that. You've got to take into account men's morale. You've got to take into account their ammunition. You've got to take into account kind of command and control.
Hmm.
So.
Hmm. Hey, we got Joe Ricci's in the chat. Homebrew. How are we doing? Have you any experience with the John Hill Johnny Reb rules? In my mind, they're the best. Then there's Fire and Fury, not so much.
Oh, I am embarrassed to say I've never actually played Johnny Reb. I have played Fire and Fury, and Fire and Fury is fine. It's not necessarily my favorite rule set. I don't do a whole lot of Civil War gaming, oddly enough, or at least not with miniatures. Um, Johnny Reb, from what I understand, has been the gold standard kind of for a long time, and I'd love to get a chance to try it out, but I've just never had the opportunity.
Mm.
Civil War is one of the few miniature or few periods that my miniature collection is pretty slim, and I
Is that
mean part
because
of
you're
that is
surrounded by it?
yeah, part of that is honestly, I haven't found a rule set that I really love, so maybe I do
Mm.
need to try Johnny Reb. And part of that is from a painting perspective. That's
Mm.
it's not the most. I mean, they're not as colorful as like my ancient Persians here, like. Um,
Yeah.
but it's on the list. I have a bunch of 15 millimeter Civil War guys that I got to get around to at some point. So I will take your recommendation and give Johnny Reb a shot.
There you go.
So
Go everybody, please go follow Homebrew History as well. They're doing some good video assets over there, and I'd love to see their work. Yeah, when you're in this area of the world visiting, it is it's a lot of 1812 miniatures, and it's just really interesting to see what all comes out when you're witnessing that, and then we get to talking like you do when you're researching. Then you get to talking about, okay, here I am, the only American around the table, and we're talking about the War of 1812, and I'm catching a little flack because of of everything, and it really has some interesting kinds of conversations, like you say. It's almost like a social club in that way, where you can be talking about these deeper questions together around certain things.
yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, no matter what kind of game it is, you're trying to set a series of historic parameters, and it kind of comes down to how you do that. Like,
Mhm.
why was the Iron Brigade so good in combat? We know they are from looking at their record in history, that they had a reputation for, but like, how do you translate that to a game? Like, are they more experienced? Do you kind of give them an arbitrary number? This is a huge question when it comes to a lot of games, and like, how do you rate a general? What makes a general good? Like, um, yeah, perfect example is there's a strategic level board game called For the People, which is the American Civil War, and it's the whole war. Well, like, okay, well, if I know Grant is going to arrive in the East in the spring of 64, like, that's going to affect how I play the game because I know he's really good. He's
Mhm.
going to give me a bonus in combat. I know Lee is going to take over in 1862. That's I'm going to plan for that kind of with hindsight. And again, that kind of, I guess, goes back to the fog of war issue. There's ways of randomizing that. There's ways of changing that.
Mhm.
Um, it's funny you mentioned War of 1812. I have a bunch of War of 1812 guys, but they're all like Chesapeake. They're like Maryland and Virginia militia, Royal Marines, and sailors and stuff like that. There's actually a game that I've had my eye on from Columbia, not Columbia, what's Compass Publishing, that covers the Northwest Rebellion. So like a really underappreciated part of Canadian history, that that I think would be a fascinating setting for a game.
Yeah.
This also raises issues of kind of, I don't know, national bias or national chauvinism when it comes to this. There's a prolific company of rule, that makes rule sets for miniature games out of Great Britain. I will not name the names, but um, it's funny how like all of the British troops in their game get all of these incredible bonuses in combat, and yet the French are terrible at everything. And there's a little bit of bias showing through in that, or even in the miniatures that you make. The vast majority of miniatures in the world today are made in the United Kingdom. I mean, there
Mm.
are places in America and elsewhere, but the United Kingdom is kind of like the Silicon Valley of miniature manufacturing. And so they tend to skew towards very Eurocentric, very Anglo-centric topics. The Napoleonic Wars are huge. The English Civil War, like huge. World War I, World War II. When you try to get into other topics, looking at feudal Japan, it's actually surprisingly popular period to game, but it's harder to find good miniatures for that.
Mm.
We've been working on these World War II guys. Australians were actually fairly easy to find, but I was looking for very specific Japanese troops and couldn't really find a whole lot of good options. It's it is an issue. I mean, as it is in almost every facet of kind of history and how we look at history is, who's making these things, who's writing these rules, who's publishing the board games. The board games, you get a much bigger variety
Mhm.
on. I've got my eye on a lot of upcoming games that cover a like crazy range of topics. Miniatures, you're gonna find them out there, but there's a huge difference in time periods and kind of geographic locations.
Mhm. Mhm.
So that's changing, but it's still kind of lagging behind the board gaming industry in that regard. Um, you know, the financial outlay on these, sculpting these figures and the molds to produce them is just crazy.
Yeah.
It's getting better. The industry is moving more towards resins and plastics and 3D printing, which is
Mhm.
really beginning to revolutionize this hobby because, with a 3D printer, you can create these miniatures. You don't have to wait for someone to sculpt it and, put tens of thousands of dollars into producing them when you
Mhm.
can just print it at home. Thankfully, one of my good friends that I game with has a 3D printer, and I'll buy these STL files, and next time I see him, he's got a bag of dudes for me, which is incredible. Something we couldn't have even imagined 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago, 25 years ago, 50 years ago. So
Yeah, that's fantastic. What are you looking forward to this year, Travis? Is there a game coming out you're looking forward to? Is there an event coming up in the 2025 you're
oh
looking
god.
forward to?
Um,
Is it too much to list?
So, unfortunately, I'm going to miss Historicon this year. I double booked
Oh,
myself, but there is a smaller convention that's hosted in the spring, and it's going to be in Gettysburg. They call it Cold Wars. Same organization organizes it, Historic
mm,
Miniature Gaming Society. It's much, much, much smaller, but I'd like to get up there for a day. Gettysburg's not that far away. So event wise, I'm looking forward to that. Gaming wise, like I said, there's I've got my eye on a bunch of games that are coming out or will be coming out soon that have really piqued my interest. Compass Games has a game coming out about Pontiac's Rebellion, which
oh,
I
that's
think would be fascinating. One of my
yeah.
very favorite board games right over here is Wilderness, where it covers the French and Indian War. So it's kind of
Mm,
like a good follow up to that. That same company is producing at some point a game about the Troubles, kind of a counterinsurgency game about
wow.
Ireland, and that is a conflict that I am deeply fascinated by. Again, kind of speaks to the morality of like we're gaming things that grew into people's lives and
Mhm,
cost people's lives, and how do we kind of reconcile with that. But I think anything that kind of gives some sort of insight into that period, I think would be fascinating.
mhm.
Um, Miniature wise, I'm not sure what my next project's gonna be. I've got a whole bunch of Assyrians on my table right now for Triumph. I've got some World War I British that I'm actually putting together for a miniature game that is the Irish War of Independence. I already have my IRA guys. I got my
Mm,
black and tans and stuff. They're somewhere around here. Um, I kind of want to flesh that out with some British troops and maybe do some Irish Free State Army to kind of take it into the Irish Civil War as well. So
wow.
um, there's always something on the table. I've got just piles of dudes.
Hey, whatever helps, you know, and
Gotta have a hobby.
yeah,
It's
you got to have a
I
hobby.
mean, for me, it's a way to kind of interact with history and connect with history in a very like Zen way. I can put my headphones on, listen to like a podcast or audiobook or something, and
Right.
just kind of paint and um, just it's very relaxing. Um,
Mhm, mhm. Yeah,
and
that's
it's
awesome.
something that I've seen myself get better at over the years, which is nice. Like there's an immediate gratification to it. So
Right,
yeah.
right. No, that's fantastic. You've started to excel at this, and meanwhile, my hobby is just writing because that's what I have to do right now. But hey, it's exercising. You're exercising your mind through this kind of a hobby, and that's what's important. Is just keeping that cognitive ability is going to keep
Yeah.
going and getting better and better
Yeah, I mean
and
every game is a puzzle, and kind of
right,
figuring that out is a huge part of the fun. And like I said,
yeah,
it keeps your mind going. So
yeah. Well, hey, pal, I appreciate you coming on and talking about this because, a few of us, I'm sure, in the chat or people who have stopped by this evening have probably watched some stuff on YouTube
mhm.
involving this because there are so many great creators out there who are filming this stuff and who are actually bringing it to a new audience. But I know you've been doing some stuff, and I'm really happy to have you on to talk about your experience a little bit and then what you're looking forward to this year.
Yeah, I mean, my pleasure. And I'll say to anyone who is interested in getting into this as a hobby, there's the internet is great. There's a ton of
Mhm.
groups on Facebook and on other Discord, so other social media. Um, the website Board Game Geek has a great community of war gamers that can talk about this stuff. Consim World, um, Historic Miniature Gaming Society has their conventions. They have smaller events, and a lot of local game stores have these clubs that will come together and play. A lot of the big games like Warhammer, but also historical games as well. So it's out there.
Mhm.
These people are out there, and it's a great hobby to get into, and it's a surprisingly easy hobby to get into. Most people like me, they have a million dudes. They just want someone to play with. You don't have to paint anything. You don't have to bring anything. Just show up. We'll teach you, and we'll have a great time. Maybe one of these days I'll make it up north of the border and we'll have a game. That'd be great.
Yeah, and I know that in my town and maybe in someone who's watching, maybe in your town as well, there are a lot of board game cafes.
Hmm.
So I know that we have at least one, maybe two in my town here. So that's a good way to meet people and to go try a game maybe before you buy it or whatever. It's a nice introduction to that and to find your people. So look in your local area on Google Maps or whatever. You may have a game cafe nearby, and I know that they are getting more and more. Uh, they're getting more and more relevant, I guess. Or they're becoming more and more prevalent, I should say, in our contemporary era. Might be something for you to check out. I don't know if you have any near you, Travis, but I'm not sure if there's
We,
one like in Leesburg or I don't
I
know.
am blessed that there's a great game store. I'm gonna just go ahead and give them a shout
Yeah,
out. Huzzah Hobbies in Ashburn, Virginia. Awesome game store.
nice.
Tons of tables, lots of space. They've got active like groups and leagues playing games. Not so much on the historic side, but there is a strong but small contingent of us historic guys. Also, big fan of your hobby place out in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Great
Mm,
selection of miniatures there. But I mean, they're there. And especially with the internet, you can order anything you could ever possibly want. And so it's there. Find a community and get out there. It's a great hobby. My daughter is already like begging to get into it. She hangs out with us when we were playing games. She rolls the dice, and um, you know, someday she'll be across the table from me playing. And there will be a whole new generation of kids into this stuff. So.
Yeah, she'll be
Yeah.
flanking you in a couple of years.
Right. Yeah. Just beating my ass. So
Yeah.
I'm the unluckiest game player you will ever play against. I am like, for
Well,
whatever
good.
reason, I lose constantly. So, uh,
It's good to keep in mind for my
yeah,
future reference.
keeps me humble. So,
Thank you, everybody in chat, for hanging out with us. I know a lot of people have been in and out all evening. It's that time of night where people are busy doing all kinds of things and are stopping in for 5 or 10 minutes. So thank you so much for that, no matter where you're joining us from. Travis, thank you again for doing this, and it's always awesome to be on with you.
yeah, anytime, buddy. Let me know. I'm always happy to be here, and it's really good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. Take care, everyone. Be safe, be well, keep reading. There's a lot of great books coming out, and a lot of great games coming out. So
Yeah.
keep yourself occupied. Take care, everybody.